The storm was relentless, and my hands tightened around the steering wheel as I squinted through the windshield. The wipers were fighting a losing battle, smearing the rain instead of clearing it. My headlights barely lit up the winding road ahead, and I couldn't remember the last time I'd seen another car. Somewhere in the back of my mind, a nagging voice told me this was my fault. I should have left earlier. I wasn't supposed to be out here in the middle of nowhere, driving through some backwoods stretch of forest. This wasn't the plan. I should have been pulling into a hotel in Asheville right about now, ready to crash and get some sleep before heading to my cousin's wedding tomorrow. But life had a funny way of turning simple things into complicated messes. The highway was backed up for miles due to an accident, and I'd figured taking the scenic route would be faster. My GPS had been cooperative at first, guiding me through winding country roads with its calm, robotic voice. But then, like a cruel joke, the signal cut out entirely. I'd laughed at first, a nervous little chuckle, thinking it was just a glitch. That was hours ago. Now I was lost. Really, truly lost. The kind of lost where every tree looked the same, and every turn seemed to lead deeper into nowhere. The rain didn't help. It blurred everything, turning the road into a slick, shiny ribbon that seemed to twist and coil like a living thing. The only sounds were the thrum of the rain on the roof and the rhythmic squeak of the wipers. I checked the clock on the dashboard. 10:27 p.m. I hadn't eaten since lunch, and my stomach growled in protest. My gas gauge wasn't looking too promising either. The little orange light hadn't come on yet, but it was only a matter of time. I bit the inside of my cheek and tried to stay calm. I'd find something soon. A gas station, a diner, maybe even a motel. There had to be something out here, right? Then I saw it. The lights appeared through the fog like a mirage, faint and golden. I almost didn't believe it at first. My tired brain tried to convince me it was just another hallucination, like the ones I'd been imagining every time my headlights hit a particularly reflective patch of rain. But as I got closer, the shape of a house came into view. It was large, Victorian, with tall windows and a steeply sloped roof. A turret jutted up from one side, making it look like something out of a Gothic novel. A sign at the edge of the gravel driveway read, "Cliffside Inn, vacancies." I pulled in without hesitation, my tires crunching on the gravel. The thought of getting out of the car and into the rain was unpleasant, but the warm, golden glow coming from the windows was too inviting to resist. I grabbed my bag from the back seat and dashed toward the front porch, my shoes splashing through puddles. The front door opened before I could knock. A woman stood there, framed by the soft light spilling out from the foyer. She was older, maybe in her 60s, with silver hair neatly pinned back and a shawl draped over her narrow shoulders. Her expression was polite, but distant, like someone who had mastered the art of customer service without ever actually enjoying it. "Ah, you poor thing. You must be soaked," she said, stepping aside to let me in. Come in, come in." The warmth hit me immediately, a welcome contrast to the chill that had settled in my bones. The foyer was quaint and charming, with polished wood floors and a large staircase that curved up to the second floor. A chandelier hung above, its crystals catching the light in a way that made the whole room feel alive. "Thank you," I said, shaking water from my hair. "I wasn't sure I'd find anything out here." She smiled faintly, her eyes flicking over me in a way that felt strangely clinical. "We don't get many visitors this time of year. You're lucky because there's a room available." Lucky, that was one way to put it. "Do you have anything to eat?" I asked, embarrassed by the way my stomach growled as I spoke. "There's tea and biscuits in your room," she said. "I'll show you up." Before I could respond, she turned and started up the stairs. Her steps were quick and deliberate, the sound of her heels echoing in the otherwise silent house. I followed, my wet shoes squeaking against the polished wood. The second floor was dimly lit, with a long hallway stretching out before us. The wallpaper was an intricate floral pattern, faded in some places, and the air carried a faint scent of lavender. She stopped in front of a door near the end of the hall and handed me a key. "This is your room," she said. "There's a list of rules on the desk. Please read them carefully." "Rules?" I asked, frowning. "House rules," she said simply. "It's very important that you follow them." She didn't wait for me to respond, disappearing down the hallway without another word. I stared after her for a moment, unsure of what to make of her abruptness, before unlocking the door and stepping inside. The room was small but cozy. A 4-poster bed took up most of the space, its quilted blanket looking inviting and warm. There was a rocking chair in the corner, an antique desk by the window, and a tray with a teapot and biscuits on the nightstand. I set my bag down and kicked off my wet shoes, grateful to finally be somewhere dry. That's when I saw the card on the desk. It was small and handwritten, the ink neat and precise. It read, "Do not lock your door until midnight. If you hear knocking, only open the door if it comes 3 times. Close the curtains before you turn off the lights, and do not look outside. If you hear humming, leave the room immediately. Do not use the front door to leave in the morning. Use the back door. Do not speak to anyone in the parlor after sunrise." I stared at the card, a chill creeping up my spine. It was probably just some quirky tradition. Old inns like this were known for their eccentricities, right? But as I set the card down and turned toward the window, I noticed something that made my heart skip a beat. The rocking chair in the corner had shifted slightly, its angle no longer facing the bed. It was now facing the window. I stood there, frozen, staring at the rocking chair. Maybe it had always been facing the window, and I just hadn't noticed. My mind was playing tricks on me, surely. I'd been driving for hours, soaked to the bone, and my nerves were worn thin. The old wood creaked softly as I stepped closer, my damp socks brushing against the thick carpet. I reached out and touched the back of the chair, half expecting it to spring to life, but it didn't move. Its worn surface felt smooth under my fingers, polished from years of use. Shaking my head at my own ridiculousness, I moved to the window. The rain had softened to a drizzle now, though fog still clung to the trees outside, wrapping the landscape in an eerie haze. I pulled the curtains closed, careful not to look too long at the distorted shapes in the fog. The last thing I needed was to spook myself further. As I turned back to the room, I caught sight of the card on the desk again. The rules stared up at me, their neat handwriting oddly insistent. House rules. Why did that phrase feel so heavy? The first rule said not to lock the door until midnight. I glanced at the clock on the wall. 11:10 p.m. A strange unease settled in my chest. Was it a safety precaution? Some kind of fire code thing? Or was it meant to keep something out? The thought made me shiver. I sat down on the edge of the bed and poured myself some tea from the tray. The warmth helped steady my hands, but I couldn't ignore the prickling sensation at the back of my neck. The kind you get when you're being watched. I glanced around the room again, my eyes lingering on the shadows in the corners. It was just an old house, creaky and full of character. That's all it was. The knock came at 11:15 p.m. It wasn't loud, just a soft tapping against the door, but it made my heart jump into my throat. I froze, gripping the teacup like a lifeline, waiting to see if it would happen again. The rules. My eyes darted to the card on the desk. If you hear knocking, only open the door if it comes 3 times. The knock came again, a little louder this time. 2 knocks, then silence. I didn't dare move. My brain scrambled for a logical explanation. Maybe it was the innkeeper checking in on me, or another guest looking for their room. But why stop after 2 knocks? The air in the room felt heavier now, pressing down on my chest like a lead blanket. I set the teacup down carefully, trying not to make a sound. A minute passed, then 2. The silence was deafening, broken only by the faint patter of rain against the window. I let out a shaky breath and forced myself to relax. It was probably nothing. I reached for a biscuit, hoping to distract myself with something normal, when I heard it again. Not knocking this time, but a low creak, like the sound of a chair shifting. The rocking chair. It hadn't moved, not as far as I could tell, but the sound had definitely come from that corner of the room. My pulse quickened as I stared at it, and then the hum began. It was faint at first, just a whisper of melody drifting through the room, but it grew louder, filling the air like a slow, haunting lullaby. My breath caught as I realized it was coming from the direction of the chair. The card's words flashed in my mind like a warning bell. If you hear humming, leave the room immediately. I was on my feet before I'd even finished processing the thought. My hands fumbled for the door handle, my fingers trembling as I turned it. The hallway beyond was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of a sconce near the staircase. The hum followed me, faint but persistent, as I stepped out into the corridor. The door clicked shut behind me, and the sound stopped. Just like that. I stood there for a moment, my heart pounding in my chest, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Maybe I was overtired. Maybe the hum had been the wind, or a trick of my overactive imagination. But the rocking chair, I couldn't explain that. The hallway stretched out before me, long and shadowy. I noticed now how unnervingly quiet the inn was. No creaks of floorboards, no murmur of voices from other guests, just silence. I realized I had no idea where I was going. Back to the lobby? To the innkeeper's quarters? My room suddenly felt like the last place I wanted to be. I made my way toward the staircase, the soft carpet muffling my footsteps. The air felt colder out here, and the scent of lavender was stronger, almost overpowering. As I reached the top of the stairs, I heard something behind me. A faint shuffle, like the sound of fabric brushing against wood. I turned, my breath catching in my throat. The hallway was empty. "Hello?" I called, my voice barely more than a whisper. It felt wrong to speak here, like I was breaking some unspoken rule, but there was no answer. I descended the stairs quickly, my hand gripping the banister for support. The lobby was just as I'd left it, warm and inviting, but now it felt wrong somehow. The chandelier above seemed dimmer, its crystals casting distorted shadows on the walls. The innkeeper appeared as if from nowhere, stepping out of the shadows like she'd been waiting for me. Her face was calm, but her eyes were sharp, piercing in a way that made me feel exposed. "Is everything all right?" she asked. My voice faltered. I wanted to tell her about the chair, the humming, the knocking, but the words felt heavy on my tongue. I thought I heard something. I managed finally. Her expression didn't change. "Old houses can be noisy," she said. "It's nothing to worry about." I nodded, but the unease didn't leave me. I wanted to ask her about the rules, about why they existed, but she was already turning away, her footsteps fading into the shadows. I lingered in the lobby, unsure of what to do. Returning to my room felt like walking into a trap, but I couldn't stay down here all night. Eventually, I forced myself to climb the stairs again, each step feeling heavier than the last. The card had said to lock the door after midnight, and the clock on the wall read 11:55 p.m. 5 minutes. That's all I needed to wait. 5 minutes, and I'd follow the rules. I stepped inside. The room was silent, the rocking chair exactly where I'd left it, facing the window. The curtains were still drawn, the teacup still on the nightstand. Everything was as it should be. But as I sat down on the bed, I noticed something new. The card on the desk had changed. A single line had been added to the bottom, written in the same neat handwriting. "Do not sleep." I stared at the card, my pulse thundering in my ears. The words "do not sleep" glared back at me, written in the same tidy script as the rest of the rules. Had that always been there? No, I was certain it hadn't been. I'd read and reread the list earlier, trying to make sense of its absurdity. This wasn't something I'd overlook. I reached for the card with trembling fingers and ran my thumb over the ink. It was dry, as though it had been written hours ago, or maybe longer. My eyes darted to the clock on the wall, 11:58 p.m. 2 minutes until midnight. I turned the card over, searching for some kind of explanation, but the back was blank. The rules sat heavy in my mind, each one layered with the sense that breaking them meant something more than just a quirky tradition. The unnerving realization hit me. The rules were changing. I stood up quickly, the creak of the floorboards beneath me feeling louder than it should have. My gaze flicked to the rocking chair, still unmoving, still facing the window. Every instinct screamed at me to get out of this room. But where would I go? 11:59 p.m. The rule was clear. Do not lock your door until midnight. I didn't dare disobey. I stood there, counting the seconds, my heart pounding in my chest. Then the clock struck 12. I slid the latch on the door, locking it with trembling hands. The moment the chime rang out, the atmosphere shifted. It was subtle at first, like the air itself exhaled, but then came the knocking, soft, deliberate, and impossibly steady. My breath hitched. I gripped the handle, as if my hand could keep whatever was on the other side from coming in. The silence stretched out unbearably. My fingers were slick with sweat, slipping against the cold metal. I waited, prayed, and then the third knock came, louder than before, reverberating through the wood like a warning bell. My knees buckled slightly, and I pressed myself against the door, listening. The card had been clear. I could open it now, but should I? I bent down, peering through the tiny gap beneath the door. Nothing. No shadow, no shoes, no hint of movement. But the tension in the air was unbearable, like whatever had knocked was still standing there, waiting. I straightened, backing away slowly, my eyes fixed on the door. I wasn't going to open it. I couldn't. My gut screamed at me to stay away, to break this rule if it meant staying alive. Then, the handle twisted slowly. I froze, gripping the edges of the mattress, my breath caught in my chest. The handle didn't move again, but I swore I heard the faint sound of breathing just outside the door. I wanted to scream, to run, to do anything but sit there, paralyzed. The room felt colder now. The window rattled slightly in its frame, though there was no wind outside. I pulled the blanket tighter around my shoulders, as if that could protect me. The clock ticked on, each second dragging longer than the last. The whisper followed soon after. It wasn't clear at first, just a faint murmur coming from beyond the door, but it grew louder, clearer, until I could make out the words. "Why don't you open the door? It's safe now." The voice was soft, almost soothing. It sounded familiar, though I couldn't place it. I stared at the door, the handle gleaming faintly in the pale moonlight that seeped through the curtains. "Come on," the voice cooed. "You're making this harder than it has to be." I clenched my fists, my nails digging into my palms. I knew better than to trust it. But the sound of it, spoken so softly, so sweetly, made something inside me waver. "You don't have to be afraid," the voice said. "Just open the door. Let me in." The rocking chair creaked. Slowly, methodically, it began to move, rocking back and forth in time with the whispers. At first, it was subtle, almost deliberate, but then it jerked forward, rocking violently, as though an unseen force had taken control. My breath caught in my throat as the whispers grew louder, morphing into a low, guttural laughter that seemed to rise from the very chair itself. I couldn't stay here. My chest tightened as panic took over. I grabbed the card from the desk, clutching it like a lifeline, and stumbled toward the door. My fingers fumbled with the latch, my mind racing. I bolted for the door, sliding the latch free and flinging it open. The whispering stopped. The rocking chair stopped. The silence returned, heavier than before. The hallway was pitch black. The sconces that had been lit earlier were extinguished now, leaving only the dim glow of moonlight filtering through a distant window. My bare feet patted against the cold floor as I moved toward the staircase. The shadows at the end of the hall shifted. A shape emerged, faint at first, but slowly growing more distinct. It was tall, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. Its movements were jerky, like it was learning how to use its limbs. I stumbled backward, nearly losing my footing, and ran. The staircase loomed ahead, its banister gleaming faintly in the darkness. My breath came in ragged gasps as I descended, my hand gripping the rail for balance. I reached the bottom and turned toward the lobby, but froze. The innkeeper stood in the middle of the room, her back to me. Her shawl hung loosely around her shoulders, and her hands were clasped in front of her. Something about her stance made my skin crawl. "I told you to follow the rules," she said, her voice quiet but sharp. "I told you not to break them." "I didn't," I started, but my voice cracked. I'm trying." She turned slowly, her pale eyes locking onto mine. Her expression was calm, but her gaze burned with something I couldn't name. "You've made it angry," she said. Behind her, the shadows twisted and writhed, taking shape. The figure emerged again, taller this time, its limbs impossibly long and its grin impossibly wide. The hollow eyes locked onto me, and the whispering grew deafening. "You'll have to pay the price now," the innkeeper said. The figure lunged toward me, faster than I expected. I stumbled back, my hands scrambling for something, anything to defend myself. My fingers closed around the candelabra on a nearby table, and I swung it wildly, the metal connecting with a sickening thud. The figure staggered, its shape flickering like a flame in the wind. But it didn't stop. It came at me again, and I swung the candelabra once more. This time, it shattered one of the lobby's tall mirrors. The glass exploded outward, shards scattering across the floor. The figure recoiled. Its grin faltered, and for the first time, it looked almost human. Its hollow eyes filled with something I couldn't identify. Fear, maybe. Regret. The innkeeper's expression darkened. "You've broken more than the rules now," she said. The figure dissolved into the shadows, leaving nothing but the shards of glass glinting on the floor. The innkeeper stepped closer, her pale eyes fixed on me. "You'll regret this," she said softly. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I ran to the back door and stepped outside. The night air was cool and crisp, carrying the scent of wet earth. The gravel crunched under my feet as I stumbled away from the house. My legs were weak, barely able to hold me upright, but I didn't stop. Every instinct screamed at me to get as far away as possible. I got into my car and left. The highway stretched out before me, empty and endless. With each passing mile, I felt myself drifting further from reality, as if the very fabric of the world had changed overnight. The days passed in a blur. I made it to my cousin's wedding, but everything felt distant, like I was watching it through a fogged window. The laughter, the music, the conversations, they all washed over me without leaving an impression. People asked if I was okay, commenting on how tired I looked. I lied and told them I was fine, but I wasn't. The dream started a few nights later, always the same. I was back at the inn, standing in the lobby. The rocking chair creaked softly, and the humming began. It was louder in the dreams, more distinct. I could hear words hidden in the melody, whispers that called my name. The shadowy figure stood in the corner, its hollow eyes watching me, its grin growing wider and wider until it split its face in two. I woke up drenched in sweat every time, the card from the inn clutched in my hand, though I knew I'd left it in the car. I burned it once, watching the edges curl and blacken in the flames. But the next morning, it was back on my nightstand, pristine and blank. I survived the inn, but a part of me stayed behind. Or maybe something else came with me.